Imagine standing in front of the one thing in your life you cannot control: your health, your future, the people you love most. Now imagine saying 5 words that somehow calm every fear attached to all of it. The Lord is my shepherd. Millions of people have said this verse at hospital bedsides, at funerals, in the middle of the night when fear will not let them sleep. But almost none of them have ever asked what the original Hebrew is actually claiming, because the English translation, as beautiful as it is, softens something that the Hebrew states with a force that should stop you in your tracks. This is not a poetic metaphor about a nice man with a staff watching sheep in a green pasture. This is one of the boldest claims about identity and belonging in the entire Bible. And once you understand the word behind shepherd, and the word behind Lord, and the tiny possessive word my sitting quietly between them, Psalm 23:1 stops being a comforting verse you memorized as a child and becomes something closer to a legal declaration of ownership, protection, and covenant loyalty that most readers have never actually received in full. Let us slow down and look at what is actually happening in this single line. The verse in Hebrew reads, Adonai ro elo exar. Word for word, that is, Lord, my shepherd, I shall not lack. Notice something immediately. There is no verb as in the original Hebrew sentence. English translators added it to make the sentence grammatically smooth, because English needs a linking verb to connect a subject to a description. Hebrew does not need that verb. The absence of is actually intensifies the claim rather than weakening it. David is not describing an occasional role that God plays. He is stating an identity so fixed, so permanent, that no verb of being is even required to hold the sentence together. The relationship simply exists as fact, the way you do not need to say the sun is bright, because brightness is simply what the sun does. David is saying the Lord my shepherd, in the same breathless, factual way you would say water, wet. Now look at the first word. Lord, written in English translations in small capital letters, is not actually the Hebrew word for Lord in the ordinary sense. It represents the 4 Hebrew letters Yod, He, Vav, He, the name so sacred in ancient Israel that it was considered too holy to pronounce aloud. Scholars often render it YHWH, and out of reverence ancient Jewish readers would substitute the word Adonai when reading scripture aloud, rather than attempt the divine name itself. This is not a generic title like master or boss. This is the personal covenant name of God, the name revealed to Moses at the burning bush when God said, I am that I am. The name tied to the Exodus, tied to the giving of the law, tied to every promise God ever made to Israel as a nation bound to him by covenant. When David opens this psalm with that name, he is not introducing a distant deity. He is invoking the specific God who rescued his ancestors from slavery, who split a sea, who carried a nation through a wilderness for 40 years. This is the name of the God who keeps promises across centuries, not the name of a vague cosmic force. And now the word almost everyone skips past too quickly, the word shepherd. In Hebrew it is roeh, coming from the verb ra'ah, to feed, to tend, to pasture, to guide. In the ancient Near East, this word carried a weight that modern readers, most of whom have never met a literal shepherd, simply cannot feel the way an original audience would have felt it. Shepherd was not a humble farming job in the ancient world. It was the standard metaphor for kingship itself. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs were called shepherds of their people. Mesopotamian kings described themselves in official inscriptions as the shepherd appointed by the gods to guide the flock of the nation. When the prophet Ezekiel later condemns the corrupt leaders of Israel, he does not call them bad politicians. He calls them shepherds who fed themselves instead of feeding the sheep. The word shepherd, in the world David lived in, meant ruler, protector, provider, and guide, all at once. To call someone your shepherd was to say this being has total authority over my life and total responsibility for my well-being. And here is where the historical detail most people never connect becomes essential. David himself was a shepherd before he was a king. He did not learn this word from a textbook. He lived it. As a boy, David spent long nights in open fields protecting sheep from lions and bears with nothing but a sling, and his own body standing between the flock and the predator. He knew from physical memory exactly what a shepherd actually does. A shepherd does not simply point sheep toward grass and walk away. A shepherd searches for water sources in dry seasons. A shepherd physically fights off wolves. A shepherd carries injured lambs across his own shoulders when they cannot walk. A shepherd counts the flock every single evening to make sure none are missing. And if one is missing, a true shepherd leaves the rest of the flock to search until the missing one is found. When David writes, "The Lord is my shepherd," he is not borrowing a poetic image from someone else's profession. He is taking the most physically demanding, self-sacrificing job he ever personally performed and saying, "God does this for me, personally, in exactly this way." This is where the tiny word most readers glide right past becomes the emotional center of gravity for the entire verse. The word, my. In Hebrew, I is not simply the word shepherd standing alone. The suffix I attach to the end of the word transforms shepherd into my shepherd, a single word in Hebrew that carries the possessive built directly into its structure. This is intensely personal grammar. David is not writing a psalm to be sung generically about God being a shepherd to Israel as an abstract crowd. He is claiming in the first person singular a direct personal ownership of the relationship. Compare this to Psalm 100, where the language shifts to "we are his people and the sheep of his pasture," a communal, corporate claim. Psalm 23 does something different and more intimate. It individualizes the covenant. The King of the universe, the eternal name revealed at the burning bush, the God who parted seas for an entire nation, is claimed here by one single voice as my shepherd. Not the shepherd of my nation, not a shepherd somewhere out there watching over the collective. My shepherd, personally assigned, personally present, personally responsible for me specifically. Now place these three pieces back together. YHWH, the eternal covenant name, tied to promises kept across generations. Roe, the ancient world's word for total, sacrificial, physically dangerous care and rulership. And the possessive I, transforming a national metaphor into an intensely personal claim. "The Lord is my shepherd" is not a soft, sentimental line for embroidery on a pillow. It is David declaring that the same God who rescued a nation from slavery has personally, individually, taken direct responsibility for guiding, feeding, protecting, and searching for him the way a shepherd protects one single, specific sheep from lions in the middle of the night. There is something else worth pausing on before we move forward, and it has to do with what a shepherd in the ancient world actually did every single day, hour by hour, because understanding the daily routine changes how you hear the rest of the psalm. A shepherd in the hill country of Judea did not simply release the flock into a field in the morning and return in the evening to collect them. The work was constant and physically exhausting. Before dawn, the shepherd would already be awake, checking the animals one by one for injuries sustained overnight, checking hooves for stones or infection, checking eyes and noses for signs of illness that could spread through the entire flock within days if left unnoticed. Sheep in this region are not naturally intelligent animals capable of finding their own water or avoiding danger. Unlike goats, which can sense threat and root themselves around it, sheep are almost entirely dependent on the shepherd for basic survival. They will walk directly into a ravine chasing grass without any awareness of the drop ahead. They will drink from contaminated water without hesitation. Left without a shepherd, a flock of sheep does not wander toward freedom. It wanders toward death, slowly and without any instinct to stop itself. This detail matters enormously for understanding what David is claiming about himself when he calls God his shepherd. He is not describing himself as a capable, independent person who occasionally receives some divine assistance along the way. He is describing himself using the psychology of an animal that cannot survive without total dependence on someone else's constant attention. This would have been an uncomfortable admission for a king to make publicly. Kings in the ancient world built their reputations on strength, military victory, personal capability. David, the same man who killed Goliath, the same man who commanded armies and built a united kingdom, opens this psalm by comparing himself not to a lion or a warrior but to a sheep, an animal known throughout the ancient world as helpless, easily led astray, and incapable of surviving alone. This is not humility as a performance. This is a king stating in the most vulnerable possible language available to him that his survival, his direction, his very safety from moment to moment depends entirely on someone else's constant, attentive care. And this brings us to a question almost nobody asks when reading this psalm devotionally. Why would the most powerful man in Israel choose the most helpless possible metaphor to describe his relationship with God? The answer connects directly back to the word roe and its royal associations mentioned earlier. In the ancient Near East, the shepherd metaphor for kingship worked in both directions simultaneously. Kings called themselves shepherds of their people, claiming responsibility and authority over the nation. But David flips the metaphor entirely upside down in this psalm. Instead of positioning himself as the shepherd king ruling over Israel, he positions himself as the sheep, and God as the true shepherd king ruling over him. This is a radical act of theological humility from a man who, by every worldly standard, held the highest possible human position available in his society. David is essentially saying that no matter how much authority he holds over his own kingdom, he remains before God exactly as dependent, exactly as vulnerable, and exactly as prone to wandering into danger as any ordinary sheep in any ordinary field. And this is where the paradox most readers never notice begins to surface. If the Lord is truly functioning as ROA, if the sacrificial, physically present search for the missing lamb kind of shepherd care is really happening, why does David spend the rest of this very short psalm describing dark valleys, enemies, and the shadow of death? Why does a psalm about total divine protection include the phrase, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death"? Should a properly shepherded sheep ever end up walking through a valley of death at all? This is the tension almost every reader misses because English translations smooth the psalm into pure comfort, when the original structure is holding comfort and danger together in the same breath, on purpose. The Hebrew word for valley here, tsalmaveth, is a compound word built from tsel, shadow, and maveth, death. It does not describe an occasional bad day. It describes the darkest, most dangerous terrain a flock could physically cross, narrow ravines in the Judean hillsides where predators could ambush from above, where a single sheep separated from the flock had almost no chance of survival alone. So here is the deeper truth the psalm is actually teaching, and it is far more useful than a simple promise that nothing bad will happen to you. The shepherd metaphor was never a promise of a life without valleys. It was a promise about whose presence walks through the valley with you. Ancient shepherds did not lead their flocks around every danger. Grazing land in the dry hill country of Israel often required moving flocks directly through narrow, shadowed ravines to reach better pasture on the other side. The danger was not avoidable. What made the difference between a flock that survived the valley and a flock that was destroyed in it was not the absence of the valley. It was the presence of a shepherd who knew the terrain, who walked ahead scouting for predators, who carried a rod to fight off attackers and a staff to guide and rescue any sheep that slipped toward the edge. David is not claiming a life free from the valley of the shadow of death. He is claiming that the shepherd walks directly into that valley alongside him, not observing from a distance, not sending him in alone, but present in it, with him. This reframes the entire verse in a way that should feel almost uncomfortable if you have only ever heard Psalm 23 read at peaceful moments. The Lord is my shepherd is not a statement that protects you from the valley. It is a statement that guarantees you will not walk through the valley without him. Those are two very different promises. One is a promise of an easy life. The other is a promise of a faithful presence inside a hard one. And when you trace this all the way back to the ancient meaning of roe as king, ruler, and protector, and back to the covenant weight carried by the divine name YHWH, and back to the deeply personal possessive baked directly into the Hebrew word roi, you begin to see that David was never promising his readers comfort without cost. He was promising them a companion who does not abandon the flock at the exact moment the terrain becomes unbearable. It is worth noticing, too, how this same shepherd language echoes across other parts of the Hebrew Bible in ways that reinforce everything we have uncovered so far. In Genesis, when the aging Jacob blesses the sons of Joseph near the end of his life, he refers to God as the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. This is one of the earliest recorded uses of this exact metaphor applied personally to an individual rather than to the nation as a whole. And it comes from a man who spent decades of his own life fleeing danger, working under a deceitful father-in-law, and wrestling literally and figuratively with uncertainty about his own survival. When Jacob calls God his shepherd near the end of a long and difficult life, he is not reflecting on a life free from valleys. He had plenty of them: betrayal by his own brother, decades of exile, the loss of a beloved wife, the presumed death of his favorite son. And yet, looking back across all of it, the word he reaches for to describe God's involvement in his life is the same word David later uses: shepherd, roe. This suggests that the metaphor was never understood by the ancient writers of Scripture as a promise of an easy life. It was consistently understood as a description of faithful presence through a hard one. The prophet Isaiah picks up this same image centuries later in a passage that adds one more piece to the picture worth mentioning here. Isaiah describes God as one who will feed his flock like a shepherd, gathering the lambs in his arms, carrying them in his bosom, and gently leading those that are with young. Notice the specific detail about carrying lambs. This is not generic language about guidance. It is describing the physical act of a shepherd lifting an exhausted or injured lamb that cannot keep pace with the rest of the flock and carrying it directly against his own body until it regains strength enough to walk again. This image, carried forward from the practical physical world of ancient shepherding, gives Psalm 23 an even deeper resonance. The shepherd does not merely walk ahead of the flock issuing directions from a safe distance. When a sheep in the flock becomes too weak, too injured, or too frightened to continue on its own, the shepherd physically carries it. This is the picture standing behind the phrase, "my shepherd." Not distant management from afar, but a willingness to close the distance completely and carry the weight personally when the sheep cannot carry itself. There is one more layer that most teaching on this psalm never reaches, and it connects Psalm 23 directly into the New Testament in a way that should stop you completely. Centuries after David wrote these words, Jesus stood in front of a crowd and said, "I am the good shepherd." The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He was not inventing new religious language out of nowhere. He was deliberately picking up the exact metaphor David used 1,000 years earlier and pushing it to its absolute limit. Ancient shepherds occasionally died defending their flocks from predators, but it was never the expectation, never the plan, never the job description. Jesus reshapes the metaphor by claiming that laying down his life for the sheep is not an unfortunate possible outcome, but the entire purpose of his identity as shepherd. If roe in Psalm 23 meant a shepherd willing to physically fight a lion to protect one sheep, the claim Jesus makes in John chapter 10 pushes that same image into something even more staggering: a shepherd who does not merely risk his life occasionally, but who intentionally lays it down completely as the defining act of what shepherding him actually means. So when you place Psalm 23:1 and John chapter 10 side by side, the personal possessive "my shepherd" receives an answer it was reaching for the entire time. David could say "my shepherd" because he trusted the covenant name YHWH to walk with him through literal valleys in the Judean hill country, but he could not yet see how far that shepherding would eventually go. He did not know that centuries later, the same shepherding love that guided flocks through shadowed ravines would eventually take on flesh and walk into the deepest valley that exists, the valley of death itself, not merely alongside humanity, but on behalf of humanity. The metaphor that began with an ancient king describing his responsibility to feed and protect his people ends in the New Testament with a shepherd who does not send anyone into the valley of death alone, because he has already walked through it first. This is why Psalm 23:1 deserves to be read slowly instead of recited from memory without thought. The verse is not really about sheep, and it is not primarily about comfort in the way a greeting card uses the word. It is a claim about identity, about the specific character of a specific covenant God, and about what that God is actually like in the middle of danger, not just in the absence of it. The question the verse quietly asks every single reader is not whether your life will include a valley. Every life includes valleys: illness, loss, uncertainty, fear in the middle of the night, all of it. The question is whether you can say "my shepherd" personally, specifically the way David said it, not as a phrase memorized from childhood, but as a claim you actually believe describes the God who is present with you inside your own dark ravine right now. Ask yourself honestly, When you say the Lord is my shepherd, are you reciting a phrase or are you making the same personal claim David made, staking your own single voice on the belief that the God who rescued a nation from slavery has personally, individually, taken responsibility for guiding you through whatever valley you are walking through today? Because that is what the Hebrew is actually claiming. Not a distant king watching a nation from far away, but Roi, my shepherd, present, searching, carrying, fighting for the one sheep who matters enough to him to walk into the shadow of death rather than let it walk there alone. If this changed the way you will read Psalm 23 from now on, you already know what this channel does with verses like this. We have gone deep into the covenant names of God, into the Hebrew behind the Psalms, into the prophetic words hidden inside verses that sound simple in English, but carry enormous weight in their original language. Every video connects to the next. Every hidden word leads somewhere. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their shepherd walks with them through the valley, rather than merely watching from a distance. The question is not whether your life includes dark valleys. It already does. The question is the same one David answered 3,000 years ago. Is the one walking through it with you truly your shepherd?